Fix that. Welcome to Northwoods, everybody. Glad you could join us here tonight for family dinner. Well, you didn't get dinner because you weren't here, but hey, you can join us for the afterglow, for the fellowship, and for the word here. So glad you could be here. We're going to do this thing. I don't know if you know how to do it from there. I say, how's everybody doing? And you know what next?
I say, do you really want to know?
Yeah. No. See, we got a newcomer here. This is Brad's down here, and I don't think he knows how this works. So just yell with everybody else now. I want to make sure I hear you now. Okay. Are you ready? Okay. How's everybody doing?
Great!
Good job. It's like you've been here before. Nice. All right. Well, there. Welcome, everybody. Last week, if you didn't catch it, tune back in, find it, search it up on the interwebs. Pastor Brad was preaching about the triumphal entry. We're going to do 3 sermons leading up to Easter here. The first is the triumphal entry, the crucifixion, and the resurrection. Brad saved the resurrection for himself. I guess all the good stuff. I don't know. We're going to talk about the crucifixion tonight, and we're probably going to do it a little bit differently than what maybe you've heard before. I think that we've done the whole the whole crucifixion thing's been done. Don't worry, Mike. Nobody can hear that coffee maker. It's okay. I think that we could show you all the pictures of the bloody pictures of from the Passion of the Christ and all these other things. You talk about the mechanics of it and the way you died from a Roman crucifixion and the way he humiliated them and all this stuff, but it's all been done. I think everybody's heard about the crucifixion. I think that we focus on the what and we look at all that stuff and we neglect the why when it comes to this. And it's the whole crucifixion thing was important. Yes, the what it had to happen, but the why it had to happen is more important. I think we focus on the spectacle and we forget about its significance. So this will be the first crucifixion sermon you've ever heard based out of Hebrews, probably. But that's where we're going to head. But first, Paul says in 1 Corinthians, "And so it was with me, brothers and sisters, when I came to you, I did not come with eloquence or human wisdom as I proclaimed to you the testimony about God, for I resolved to know nothing while I was with you except Jesus Christ and him crucified." This is Paul, who, if you do some studying, it's kind of a hobby of mine. I like doing some studying. This guy, he could tell you about what's going to happen on the day of the Lord and the various heavens and all these. I mean, he knew the deep mysteries of God. He knew all this stuff that more and more when I study, he drops little tidbits of things here and there. Like, wait a minute, Paul, you can't just leave a little nugget of that and not tell me the rest of it, because he knew the mysteries of God. And yet, when he went to Corinth to preach to them, he said, I determined to know nothing but Jesus Christ and him crucified. That's it. That's all you needed to hear. The crucifixion, like if you say, I'm just trying to, the pivotal nature of it, say sin and grace is a big thing, and in church, and life and death is a big thing in the church. If you view it like scales, you see the scales of justice. There's a weight on this side and a weight on this side. The crucifixion is the fulcrum on which that whole thing pivots. The crucifixion is the pivot between life and death. It's the pivot between sin and grace. It's what makes one become the other. It's the access through which all that can happen is the crucifixion. That's why Paul says, forget about everything else. I'm going to tell you about this. So tonight I don't want to talk about how much Jesus bled and how long he might have breathed on the cross and all that stuff. I want to talk about why. Because if you're not familiar with all this and you tune in tonight and you hear me talking about all these facts about, crucifixion and bleeding from his forehead and all these other things, you might think, what is wrong with these people? All they talk about is blood and death and washing in the blood. I'm going to get to wash myself in the blood like it's some scene from Psycho or something. What's wrong with these people? So let's talk about why instead of the what tonight. Paul says, let's talk about Jesus Christ and him crucified, and that's it. if you go back, all the way back to the beginning, okay, maybe 3 chapters later in Genesis 4, when Cain kills Abel, God comes down and says, hey, what'd you do? What do you mean what'd I do? Where's your brother? Well, I don't know. Don't tell me you don't know. He said, his blood cries to me from the ground. There's a concept in the Old Testament. It's called blood guilt. And it's like this. If once someone was killed, then there was a price to be paid. And the price to be paid was blood, to recompense for that blood. When sin came in, God killed some animals to cover Adam and Eve. Death had to happen to cover those sins. There was a blood guilt. Then it had to be paid. Now you can say, well, God's God, right? So if he's merciful and all that, why didn't he just forget about it? Just wipe that off and we'll start over, or just pretend it didn't happen. I can tell you, without delving too deeply into that, if you think this world's broken now, just imagine if there was no penalty for our actions, for sin, what this world would look like. Forgiveness and wiping it clean is all fine and dandy when I did something. But when if I kill somebody, well, God, just forget about it, right? I mean, it's not that. We'll just start over. I'm sorry, all that. But what about when somebody kills someone close to me? Well, then it's not okay, because that person was close to me. There's a blood guilt and I want it paid, right? So how you feel about that depends on your perspective. For justice to be just, it has to be consistent. It has to be absolute. God can't just say, oh, never mind, we'll forget it and start over. The blood guilt has to be assuaged. It has to be paid. It has to be fixed. So we had a problem. Man sinned. We thumbed our nose at God, said, we don't want you. Forget it. So we could be our own God. We could be our own master. And I'm cramming in a whole lot of scripture here, but the problem was then we realized God's over there and I'm over here, but I still kind of need God. So now what do I do? God had to make a way for us to get back to him. There had to be a substitutionary death. There had to be a way for us to get back to him. So that's when we're going to turn to Hebrews. We'll start right in the middle of Hebrews 9, and then we'll kind of jump around in there a little bit. Right in the very beginning of Hebrews 9, it talks about how God told Moses how to make the tabernacle, and he made all the fixtures for the tabernacle, and there was all this stuff, and there was the outer court where everybody could congregate, and then there was the holy place where they had, an altar of incense, and the brazen altar would be outside. They'd go in, and there's a table of showbread and stuff, and I mean, all the stuff we're not going to get into right now, but it was modeled after a heavenly model. And then there was this Holy of Holies place where only the high priest would go, and only once a year. And when he did go, they would tie a rope around his ankle, because he was going into the presence of God. And they were like, are you clean enough? I don't know if I'm clean enough. I think I'm clean enough. Well, here, let's tie this around your ankle in case you tip over dead, because if you're not out in 15 minutes, we're pulling you out. They were really worried about this going into the very presence of God, because they were just men like you and me. So in verse 16, we get to this part. In the case of a will, it's necessary to prove the death of the one who made it, because a will is in force only when someone has died. It never takes effect while the one who made it is living. This is why even the first covenant, he's talking about Moses and the law and all that stuff, where they had the sacrifices, even the first covenant was not put into effect without blood. When Moses had proclaimed every command of the law to all the people, he took the blood of the calves together with the water, scarlet wool, and branches of hyssop, and sprinkled the scroll and all the people. He said, this is the blood of the covenant which God has commanded you to keep. In the same way, he sprinkled with the blood both the tabernacle and everything used in its ceremonies. In fact, the law required that nearly everything be cleansed with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness. That's a key phrase there at the end. Without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness. That blood guilt has to be repaid somehow. So God made a way for they could go through all these sacrifices and cover that up so that they could have access to God. That's what they did in the Old Testament. And it kind of worked. And there are people who lived under that system that we'll see in heaven. But it also kind of relied on man quite a bit. And in case we hadn't discussed it enough, man's kind of broken. We're not real good at this whole follow the law thing. And it became an issue. It became an issue because we found ways to try to, well, if I make this rule about the law, then I could kind of get around the law. And if I do it this way and that way, well, then maybe, without getting political, binary is kind of a hot topic term for our world today. Binary and its counterpart, non-binary. Binary just means it's like a computer thing, 1 or 0. Old computer logic is 1 or 0. It's on or it's off. There's 2. That's what binary means. With God, everything's pretty well binary. It is or it isn't. In Revelation, it talks about those who worship the beast and those who are persecuted by the beast and worship Christ. There is no, and those in the middle who are, thinking about it. There's one or the other. There is or there isn't. So what man did with the law was say, it's all the black and white, we need some gray, because gray's more comfortable. I think deep down we all want to be better, but at the same time we'll all settle for the illusion that we're getting better if we don't really have to do the work to get better. I just kind of want to feel better. There's a lot of churches that survive on that. There's a lot of churches that thrive on that. I don't need to make you better. I just need to make you feel better. And just here, I'll make you feel better. Just put the money here. That's kind of an aside. I don't know. We'll skip right over that. But there's a substitutionary death that was required, and that's what we saw in the Old Testament. And like I said, it didn't work all that well. So God, in our eyes, God came up with a new plan. God says, I have a new covenant. We'll do a new thing. But at the same time, I just want to point out that from God's perspective, I remember I talked about in Revelation where I said there was those that worship the beast. And in Revelation 13:8, it says, there were those that worship the beast whose names were not written in the book of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. Not the Lamb slain when God realized his first plan was faulty, or the Lamb slain after God saw the error of his ways. It's interesting. That's Revelation 13:8, and we had the Hebrews 13:8 up here tonight that said Jesus Christ the same yesterday and today and forever. Forever. This plan wasn't God deciding, hey, that's broken, I'm going to do something new. This was God's plan all along. So, why didn't God do it that way all along? I don't know. You have to ask him. There's a sequence to things. When I'm building stuff, there's a sequence to things. People say, hey, why don't you put in the flooring? It's like, well, I think I'll put the shingles on first. It makes more sense. God's playbook and his whole plan, it's a little beyond me. I'm not going to pretend to know all those answers, but this was God's plan all along. This wasn't God's plan B. And Jesus knew it. In John, this will be our one, I think maybe our only reference to the Gospels and our sermon about the crucifixion. So there you go. Jesus said this, the reason my Father loves me is that I lay down my life, only to take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down and authority to take it up again. This command I received from my Father. Jesus telling his disciples, before this ever happens, they didn't even figure out the whole crucifixion thing, let alone the resurrection thing. And he's telling them, I'm going to lay down my life, but only to pick it up again. I have authority to lay it down. I have authority to pick it up. Watch and see. They didn't understand it. They missed it. But Jesus knew what was coming. Jesus knew what the crucifixion was going to be. He knew what the resurrection was going to be. Not only while he was here, but before he got here. Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. That means that way back when Jesus knew this day was going to come, he came anyway. Way back when God knew that what it was going to require to redeem us, and he made us anyway, because the price to redeem us is worth our presence to him. If that doesn't tell you something about the love of God, I don't know what does. The idea of redemption, it's hard to explain sometimes, but here's just my little probably failed attempt. Think about a coupon. You get this little coupon, and it says, redeem this coupon for something, 1 free ho-ho when you buy a Twinkie, whatever it is. You redeem that coupon by taking it to its maker and fulfilling what it says on there. I can take this thing over to Little Debbie all day long and say, here, I bought a Nutty Buddy, I want my ho-ho. And they say, you're at the wrong store. I don't know what you're talking about. That's not worth anything to me. We have two systems of thought in this world. They're at enmity. They're opposites. You have the God that made you and made a way to redeem you. And you have the world that tells you you're not worth anything. We continually want to take that redemption and spend it on the world, and they tell us you're nothing. You're an accident. You're not worth anything. We need to realize we're redeemed by a God who made us, and when we take that, we look at the face value of that, what Christ did, and take it to God to redeem us. He's the one that looks at us and says, you have value. He is the one who made us. He is the one who gave us that opportunity for redemption. He is the only one that recognizes our value and redeems us. The world doesn't. It doesn't mean anything to them, to him, to Satan, only to Christ. So, jumping right back into Hebrews, we're going to go back a few verses. This is the same chapter, and what we're going to do is we'll start further back now and read some of the stuff that came before it to set up what we read at first, and hopefully it'll make more sense or some sense or something. So again, I said, in the very beginning of this chapter, it talks about the high priest in the temple and all that, and I didn't want to go through all of that because I didn't want to be here forever, but although that clock hadn't been changed when I got here, so it was an hour back, so I could have preached for an hour and a half and you guys would have had no idea, just saying. But when Christ came as high priest of the good things that are now already here, he went through the greater and more perfect tabernacle that is not made with the human hands. That is to say, is not a part of this creation. We say when Moses was told this tabernacle, all this stuff to create, he built it after a heavenly model. Christ came, he made his sacrifice, and instead of going through the holy place and all that stuff like the priests had to do, he ascended to heaven. He didn't go through this tabernacle made with our hands. He went through God's. He did not enter, verse 12, by means of the blood of goats and calves, but he entered the most holy place once for all by his own blood, thus obtaining eternal redemption. The blood of goats and bulls and the ashes of a heifer sprinkled on those who are ceremonially unclean sanctify them so that they are outwardly clean. How much more then will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself unblemished to God, cleanse our consciences, if I could read it would help, from acts that lead to death so that we may serve the living God. Christ is, like I said, we had this problem. We needed a sacrifice to take away our guilt. God made a way for do that with the high priest and the sacrifice and all that stuff. Now Christ comes. He offers himself as a sacrifice. And it said here that old system that would kind of get you outwardly clean so that you could function, until you get back in the temple again. Christ's sacrifice makes us inwardly clean. It's just like the temple that Moses built was a picture. It was a shadow. It was a representation of what God has in heaven. The sacrifice that they made in that temple is but a shadow of what Christ did. It was an image. It was a thing for us to see until the fulfillment came. The thing that really makes us clean. It really, really makes us be able to approach God. And that was Christ's sacrifice. And not only did he offer himself as that sacrifice, But he passed into we'll continue on. That's not the part I'm looking for. Okay, and this is where we read before. So Christ made that. I think I skipped one. Straighten yourself out, Gary. For this reason, Christ is a mediator of a new covenant, that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance, now that he has died as a ransom to set them free from the sins committed under the first covenant. And Jesus came in, and they had the Passover meal. And right before this, it's not an accident that all this happened at Passover week. One, Christ is the Passover lamb, and we see that through all this. Two, that ensured that Jerusalem was bursting at the seams with people. And as many people as possible were going to see what was about to go down. At that Passover meal, Jesus takes the cup of redemption during the Passover. And if you're not sure what that is, come in a couple of Saturdays here when we do the Passover meal, and you'll figure out what it all means. Jesus says what? He said, this cup is the new covenant in my blood. What are you talking about, Jesus? You're drinking your blood? What do you mean? Jesus is a mediator of a new covenant, that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance, now that he has died. He was telling them this at that time, but they didn't fully understand it yet. I'm doing a new thing. There's going to be a new covenant, a once-for-all sacrifice, and I'm going to give you access to it. And I want you to do this to remember that, is what I want you to do. So then he says, it goes on to say, in the case of a will, we read that before, this is why in the first covenant was put into effect without blood. Moses had proclaimed every command of the law to all the people. He took the blood together with the water, sprinkled it on the scroll, and he said, this is the blood of the covenant. This is blood of the old covenant, Moses said. Well, he didn't say that, but that's what it was. Jesus said, this is the blood of the new covenant. Moses set up the old system of sacrifice that shadowed what Jesus was going to do. In the same way, he sprinkled with the blood both the tabernacle and everything used in its ceremonies. In fact, the law requires that nearly everything be cleansed with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness. Going on, it was necessary then for the copies of the heavenly things to be purified with these sacrifices. Not only did the people need to be purified and the ministers need to be purified, but the stuff that they made had to be purified so it could be used. But the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these, for Christ did not enter a sanctuary made with human hands that was only a copy of the true one. He entered heaven itself, now to appear for us in God's presence. Just pause there for a minute. Again, the shadow, the reality. The priest would make this sacrifice, and once a year on Yom Kippur, he would go into the Holy of Holies and try to make atonement for his people. And then he would hopefully live long enough to get back out of it again. Jesus gave himself. He ascended to heaven, and he walked not through the veil made with human hands. He has become the veil. He went to heaven and walked into God's presence, into God's throne room himself, and sits there as our high priest and offers himself now as that sacrifice to purify us. Not some man in some temple doing his thing, but Jesus himself in the presence of God become our high priest and our sacrifice. We don't need to do anything anymore except come to him. It's all been done. Jesus fixed our problem. He paid our price. I should probably look at my notes once just in case. I don't know. I probably skipped stuff. You'll never know it. So Jesus comes into God's very presence to make this offering. And he stays there to intercede on our behalf. 25, nor did he enter heaven to offer himself again and again, the way the high priest enters the most holy place every year with blood that's not his own. Otherwise, Christ would have had to suffer many times since the creation of the world. But he has appeared once for all at the culmination of the ages to do away with sin by the sacrifice of himself. Just as people are destined to die once, and after that to face judgment, so Christ was sacrificed once to take away the sins of many, and he will appear a second time, not to bear sin, but to bring salvation to those who are waiting for him. It takes away how many bulls and how many rams, Jesus did it once for all. The ultimate sacrifice, finally, for us. So this is the why. So it still seems kind of weird to me. Well, I don't have all those deep-seated answers you might want, maybe, but there was a penalty that had to be paid, a penalty we could not pay. No matter how we tried, no matter what we did, we could not pay it. God devised a plan for us to be able to. Jesus came and became that sacrifice. That's the why. That's why the crucifixion. Why it had to be that, I don't know. I think a nice, peaceful die in your sleep would have been better, but it wasn't up to me. But what that does, the stigma of the cross, the spectacle of the cross does, is help us recognize that Jesus came through all that, did all that, because you're worth it. And I know we live in a world that tells you you're not worth it, but I'm telling you, you're worth it. God thinks you're worth it. God made you, then he, with his own hands, carefully crafted you, and then he went through this to buy you back, to win you back, so you could be with him. I mean, we're going to jump now. This is the payoff. I like this verse, so bear with me. Maybe it's because we're doing Revelation. And again, Gary's got to remember to save it a different format so it doesn't cut off the bottom of his slides. Maybe someday. But I'll read it from here so I can see it. Then, this is Revelation 5. Then I saw a lamb, looking as it had been slain, standing at the center of the throne, encircled by the 4 living creatures and the elders. The lamb had 7 horns and 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits sent out into all the earth. He went and took the scroll from the right hand of him who sat on the throne. And when he had taken it, the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders fell down before the Lamb. Each one had a harp, and they were holding golden bowls full of incense, which are the prayers of God's people. If you're wondering what all that stuff is, well, there's a Bible study on Revelation as it happens that you could tune into, so you could figure some of that out. But don't worry so much about the spectacle here, and look at the point. Christ is the Lamb. He's the Lamb because of his sacrifice. In verse 9, and they sang a new song, saying, "You are worthy to take the scroll and to open its seals, because you were slain. And with your blood you purchased for God persons from every tribe and language and people and nation. You've made them to be a kingdom and priests to serve our God, and they will reign on the earth." That's why the cross. That's why the crucifixion. So instead of death, we can have that. We can have life. We could be with Christ. He's even in the death of Christ, when Satan thinks he's victorious because, look, I killed him. Woohoo! He doesn't know what's coming. He doesn't know what happens on Sunday. That resurrection happens, and we'll hear more about that next week. I don't want to give too much of a spoiler alert, but the resurrection, that life, comes in 3 days, but without the crucifixion, we won't have access to that. We don't have a way paved for us to get into God's presence. That's what the crucifixion does. And that's why all those weird Christian people are talking about being washed in the blood, being cleansed, about the crucifixion, not because we think blood's cool, but because there was a price to be paid, and God paid it. So, you remember back when I said, why doesn't God just forget about the whole death thing and just do something different? Well, okay, he kind of did. He made a way, despite the whole death thing, for us to be with him. And it didn't cost us much of anything. It cost him dearly. I was wrong. There's one more Bible verse from the Gospels. We'll go back to John once. I think this kind of sums it up. Thomas said to him, Jesus said, I'm going to prepare a place for you. Where I go, you could come. And Thomas says, Thomas said to him, Lord, we don't know where you're going, so how can we know the way? I Googled Google Maps, heaven, I got nothing. What do you want me to do here? And Jesus answered, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. You've probably heard that verse before. That's one that gets thrown around a lot. But understand, how do I know the way? The context of that is Thomas says, I don't know the way. Jesus said, I'm the way. You want to know how to get to heaven? You're looking at the way. I am the way. I am the truth. In him is all the truth of God wrapped up. The truth is that we needed a way back to God, and he became it. He is the life. Just like we saw in Hebrews, his death made a way for us. And Paul teaches, and this is stealing a little bit from your stuff next week, but Paul teaches that we know that we have life because of Christ's resurrection. His resurrection is the proof of our life after death, our proof of our victory over death. His crucifixion is our access to that. So he is the way, he is the truth, and he is the life. No one comes to the Father except through him. That's what Jesus was telling them. He hadn't paved that way yet, so they didn't quite understand it, but he was working on it. I was going to go do something different here tonight, and I worked really hard on it, and I had this other idea, and I was trying to put the two together, thinking, well, they must go together then, because I feel God's kind of leading me in this direction, but I know this is where it got to be. And finally I got to the point where it's like, okay, this is what I think it ought to be, but this is what God really wants. So I'm going to have to throw all this stuff away, and it was about 3:30 today. I was scrapping all my slides and my notes and starting over, so it was an interesting couple of hours. But I kind of originally wanted to talk about the people who were present at the crucifixion and what they saw. Because depending on who they were and where they stood, they saw something different. The crucifixion was a singular event, but what they brought with them and where they stood and what they thought flavored how they saw it and what conclusions they came up with. I'm not going to go through all that. There's a bunch of it. Maybe someday we will, because there's some good stuff in there. At least I think so. But I am just going to grab one couplet of people who were there, and I don't know if I got any scriptures on this. I'm just going to read it. This is Luke 23:39. One of the criminals who hung there. He's talking about there's Jesus on the cross in the middle, a criminal hanging on either side. One of the criminals who hung there hurled insults at him. Aren't you the Christ? Save yourself and us. But the other criminal rebuked him. Don't you fear God, he said, since you're under the same sentence? We're punished justly, for we're getting what our deeds deserve. But this man has done nothing wrong. Then he said to Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus answered him, I will tell you the truth. Today you will be with me in paradise. These guys hung on either side of Jesus, saw everything that went on. They looked at him from either side. And one guy said, well, he's just like me. And the other guy said, I want to be like him. All this stuff, all this why of the crucifixion, what it was for, comes down to, what are you going to do with it? God did this for you to make a way to be with him. These guys hung right there and saw it happen. And one of them said, can't you do something for me? And the other one said, I believe. Regardless of where you stand today, where you've been, all that other stuff, whatever your perspective is, again, it's black or white. God is telling you, I've done this for you. Are you going to choose to accept it? Or are you going to choose to walk away from it? That was loud. So we're gonna play a song here. It's actually probably my favorite song at the moment. So if you don't like it, you can blame me. But I think it fits pretty well. And when we listen to it, just think about the crucifixion. I know you've all got the pictures in your head of what it is. And if you don't, Google it. Google Roman crucifixion. Google Roman scourging. You can see all the blood and gore. You see what Christ actually endured physically for us. But as we just listen to that, think about the price that was paid, the offer that's before us, and what we're going to do with it. The song is "Thank You for the Blood Applied." Thank you, Jesus, for the blood applied. Google that, you'll find it. It's a pretty recent song. At home, you can listen to it, but we can't play it. So we're going to turn this off, and we're going to play it here. So I'm going to say good night in 3, 2, 1. Good night.